I thought we could begin with some questions. How do we perceive social reality? What is objectivity? And in this age of empire, how do we arrive at the truth? I thought I would start with small questions and then build up from there, you know. The usual criticism made about objectivity is that it doesn't exist. We're not just passive receptors sponging up images and information. Perception involves selecting and omitting all the time. Right now, you're omitting certain thousands of stimuli, and you're hopefully focusing on a particular few. Perception involves organizing data into comprehensible forms. In a word, the act of perceiving is itself an act of editing. But the mental selectors we use to organize our perceptions are not mostly of our own creation. Much of our personal perception is not that personal. Rather, it's shaped by a variety of things outside ourselves, such as the dominant ideology, conventional social values, one's position in the social structure, which prefigures one's experiences and connections, and the available flow of information and disinformation, and the potential benefits and losses attached to the perception. It was Upton Sinclair who once said, "It's hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." So there are a lot of different. So perception itself is related to interest, and interest, of course, is related to material forms of class power and social power and things like that. In his book, which he wrote 65 years ago or so, Carl Becker, a book called The Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers, 1932, he proposed the concept of a climate of opinion as determining certain things. He was one of the first to use that term, a climate of opinion. And he made an interesting point. He said, you know, we always say so-and-so wrote a book and created these ideas in that time and all that, and just led the way and imposed these ideas on an age or something. He said, generally that's not true. He wouldn't have thought of writing the book if those ideas weren't in circulation already, and they weren't being argued by people, and he enters the fray and maybe gives it a little bit more refinement or something. But these things were already in the air. 40 years after Becker, you get Alvin Gouldner, sociologist, and he writes about the background assumptions, and he says, what determines whether we accept or reject something is not the evidence and the argument, it's how congruent the things come, the stimuli, this data, this information, these arguments, how congruent they are with the background assumptions we already make, the implicit things that are already there. Walter Lippmann called those the pictures in our heads, that we don't see things and then define them. We first define them and then see them according to the definition we put on it. Today, an analogous concept might be the dominant paradigm, which is a term that's used often. A paradigm is a philosophical or theoretical framework within which empirical hypotheses are drawn and tested and scientific theory is developed. Paradigm, in more popular or common parlance, has, within the last, 15, 20 years, has really just come to mean the mainstream ideology. I don't know if you have bumper stickers out here, and I live in the Bay Area in San Francisco, so you're going to see all sorts of bumper stickers, but one of them is subvert the dominant paradigm. A pretty esoteric bumper sticker when you think about it, but So there it is. It made it to bumper stickers. It has a certain currency. The dominant paradigm, like the climate of opinion, background assumptions, blah, 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 the dominant paradigm is based on a unanimity of basic assumptions. And that unanimity of basic assumptions is often what passes for objectivity. Various people all agree on certain things, have the same ideological premises, then they all talk to each other and believe they're being very objective. And if that objectivity is really little more than this conformity of biases or dominant paradigms, then isn't one paradigm about as reliable or unreliable as another? Is all truth then nothing more than opinion and belief? And if not, what makes a dissident heterodox analysis better than an orthodox one? Well, that's not a rhetorical question. That question I'd like to answer. First, radical views, dissident views that are outside the mainstream generally, but not always, but generally are more reliable than the dominant view because they're more regularly challenged and tested against evidence. They don't get a free ride down the mainstream. They're not supported by the unanimity of bias that passes for objectivity. They're not supported by the universe of discourse fabricated by the corporate media, for instance. Second, we can value an opinion by the functions it serves. This is all, by the way, bringing me up to the question of empire. I'll get to that in a few minutes. If you value an opinion by the function it serves, then the heterodox view has a special task. The heterodox, as opposed to the orthodox, the heterodox function is to contest the prevailing orthodoxy, to broaden the boundaries of debate, to wake people up, to unearth suppressed data. The function of orthodox opinion is just the opposite: to keep the parameters of discourse as narrow as possible, to dismiss evidence that ill-fits the dominant paradigm. So all opinions are really not of the same value. It depends on what they're being used for, what interests they serve. We've all observed that if something doesn't fit what people believe, what happens if something doesn't fit what people believe? You confront somebody with some information and they deeply believe something contrary. What do? They say, "Oh, I didn't realize that. You're right, and I will discard my beliefs now." Well, your laughter answers that question. What they usually do is they marshal up their reserve defenses, they move to fallback positions, they qualify this or that and all that. They hang on tenaciously and they confront you right back. It's called visiting relatives, usually, is what it is. I remember I was teaching at Cornell University back in I don't remember now. I think it was the 1970s, yeah. Somewhere in there, late 70s. And I was there as a guest professor, and I was teaching a course on the media. And we were about halfway through the course, and some students in class complained, and they said, "We're getting only one viewpoint in this class." And I said, "Well, in fact, you've got this reading and that reading and this reading, and I don't really agree with various of these readings, and we have discussed other perspectives. But you know what? You're really right. That is, you're getting a very critical view of the major media, which is really at variance with what those of you who want to become working journalists really want to hear. And that's true." And then I said, "How many of you," it was a senior class, senior, junior, upper class course, I said, "How many of you have had other social science courses?" Social science is sociology, psychology, history, political science, and communications. All their hands went up. You've all had at least 3 or 4 courses? Yes, all the hands went up. I said, and how many of you in those classes got this point of view? Not a single hand went up. A measurement of the ideological diversity at Cornell University. And then I said, and how many of you complained in those classes that you were getting only one point of view and not a dissident or critical point of view? Again, no hands went up. So I said, so your complaint isn't really that you're getting only one point of view, but that for the first time you're getting another point of view and you find it irritating and you don't like it and it doesn't fit with your background assumptions and so forth and so on. People often don't think politically. They think religiously when addressing themselves to politics. I think it's with very good reason that we employ terms like dogma, sectarian, schism, orthodox, doctrinaire. When we're discussing political phenomenon, it's an implicit recognition that really you're dealing with religion in a sense in terms of the fervor and the manner of belief and the manner of which information and ideas and arguments are embraced. It's a pretty rough thing. Let me give you an example. Let me tell you about the Soviet Union. Now this is a subject that's really outside the dominant paradigm. This is a forbidden subject. There are certain subjects you just don't try to ever utter a positive word about. Howard Zinn, not long ago, referred to the Soviet Union as a monstrosity. Noam Chomsky, a little while ago, referred to the Soviet Union as a monstrosity. They both used the same word, different times, a year apart. Here's what I thought of the Soviet Union. I thought that the Soviet Union had certain features that were worth emulating. It's not that I didn't, and people on my slice of the political spectrum on the left didn't make criticisms of the Soviet Union. I can show you passages where I've written about things that were wrong with that system and so forth and so on and all that. It's that I deigned to say something positive about it. I thought there were certain features that were worth keeping even after the Soviet Union had been overthrown, like universal health care, free education, affordable housing, and other components of the social wage, guaranteed right to a job. I thought those were pretty good things, and that all of that has been destroyed at great suffering. All the public capital has been stolen by private swindlers and oligarchs. So I advocated what social scientists call differential object appraisal. That is, when you look at something, don't just slap it with one label, but see that it might be multidimensional, and you can appraise different parts of it in different ways. I also worried that the demise of the USSR would leave the US unrestrained in wielding its power, bombing, invading, and destroying other countries at a greater rate and ferocity, and unfortunately, that has proven all too true. You know, the Soviets gave aid to national liberation struggles around the world, including Cuba and Nelson Mandela's African National Congress in South Africa, for which he voiced open acknowledgement and appreciation. The same Mandela whom the US and its CIA helped to throw into prison. The orthodox anti-Marxists and the orthodox anti-communists do not allow for differentiated object appraisal. I sling that label on them because they always refer to us as orthodox Marxists or something, when we're not being called Stalinists or some other nut term like that. And as I say, calling, just dismissing, needing, feeling compelled, 13 years after the Soviet Union has been destroyed, feeling compelled to still refer to it as a monstrosity. Is that an analysis? And what of the free market paradise that has replaced existing communism? Not a word from the left intellectuals who applauded the reactionary victories of the free market. Not a word from them of all these left leading intellectuals What about the countries that now exist in Eastern Europe? What about Russia today? What do we say? Are they not full of praise for these countries, for their pro forma democratic elections? Are there many things they like about it? If so, why don't we hear about it? Are there things they don't like about it? That short of being a monstrosity, there are things that are unfortunate. If so, why don't we hear about it? But what is the great advance that's come? What part of the poverty and record suicides and prostitution and sex trafficking and unemployment and homelessness in these countries, what part of that represents an historical advance? Well, interesting, I was reading Richard Pipes. Now, Richard Pipes is a Harvard Sovietologist. Correction, he's a Harvard anti-Sovietologist. He was one of the people all during the Cold War that led the charge, courageously fighting against imaginary hordes of U.S. Marxists that were just all over the place, apparently, if you listen to these guys. Well, in 2005, this same Richard Pipes conducted an extensive survey in Eastern Europe and Russia, and what's the former Soviet Union. He found the following, much to his unhappiness and discomfort, but it's to his credit that he published the study. Maybe he couldn't suppress it, I don't know, but he did publish it. He found that the great majority of respondents were no longer in love with the capitalist paradise now that they're living in it. 74% regret the demise of the Soviet Union and believe life was better under communism. Yow. Similar results in other ex-communist countries. By the way, the adversities that have afflicted these countries have been reported in the Western press over the last decade and a half or more, but with no explanation, relatively little commentary, relatively little analysis, except for the occasional fallback position of blaming the people's unhappiness not on their present-day free market existence, but on the long-past socialism. So we hear that Russians are having a hard time learning self-reliance and individual initiative and the like, because for so many years they lived in this other kind of spoon-fed totalitarian system. It is hard. Individual initiative is hard when you lose your job and you're facing inflation and your pension is disappearing and the like. Although things are getting better more recently, differential object appraisal, oil prices are such that Putin has really, some of the pension funds, some of them being refurbished, and there is some growth in the economy and consumption and the like. When the orthodox view becomes so entrenched, evidence really becomes irrelevant. Let me give you another utterly taboo subject: the demonization of the Serbian people and their democratically elected president, Slobodan Milosevic. I think that was one of the really great propaganda achievements that took in many liberals and many progressives also. I wrote a book about it called To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia. If you're interested, you can find it on my website. These are people, many people on the left, who stood shoulder to shoulder with Bill Clinton and the White House and NATO and the CIA, bombing Yugoslavia into submission, shoulder to shoulder. Even Carla Del Ponte, the hanging judge handpicked to preside over the rigged kangaroo court in Geneva, which has no relation to the World Court, it just happens to be, opportunistically they put it in Geneva. Even she admitted last year that the prosecution had no evidence to support the charge of genocide against Milosevic and Serbia. Let me point out to you, I visited the country a few months after the war. The terrible toll on human life that was taken there, far more than the 3,000 the U.S. lost on 9/11. Much of the infrastructure destroyed. Let me point out also, though, that Serbia was the only republic that remained, and as far as I know still remains, multi-ethnic. It has not done ethnic cleansing. In Serbia, you have a substantial Albanian population, you have Bosnians, you have Montenegrins, you have even Croatians and the like. Ethnic cleansing has continued since 1999 in Kosovo, and not a word about it. When it's recognized, the term is never used. Of Jews, Roma, and Serbs being driven out of Kosovo by the right-wing KLA, Kosovo Liberation, Albanian Liberation thugs. Well, it doesn't matter to make those arguments, though. It doesn't matter to say we didn't find 10,000 bodies in Kosovo. We didn't find 8,000. We didn't find 100,000, 20,000. All those different figures that were slinged around. We found a couple of thousand people who were dead from causes not that well established. Usually, not necessarily violence, and from ethnic group undetermined and like. That kind of evidence becomes irrelevant when the image has been pounded home so that one gets a knot in one's stomach just to hear such contrary and such iconoclastic ideas and feels discomforted at even having to entertain them. So this brings us back to this whole question, well, what is truth then? What do we believe? What are we not going to believe? It's not easy to answer. You can sort of back into that question. You can back into it by saying that we know truth exists because we know liars exist. We may not always know when our rulers are lying to us, but after a while we can catch on to certain things. And we know some examples already. Weapons of mass destruction, Al-Qaeda links, etc., and that sort of thing. And you know what the saying is, you can't fool all the people all the time. But if you do it once, by the way, it's good for 4 years, as you know. One way of maintaining the dominant paradigm is by the slighting of content. That is, there just isn't any content, there just isn't enough information. And I often find that a radical dissident analysis consists of just gathering information that's being suppressed and being ignored. And this happens time and again. It reminds me of what C. Wright Mills said a long time ago, that in the face of such a vapidity, is there such a word as vapidity? Vaporousness? Vapidity? Whatever, we made up a new word. In the face of such vapidity, in the face of such informational poverty, sometimes a few simple facts are a radical act, the marshalling of some simple facts. And by the way, there isn't such a scarcity of information. I mean, there's enormous amounts of information. The news never stops. You can go on TV and radio and all. You can get 24 hours. You can get 24 hours a day. It's the vapid quality. It's the lack of viable analysis. It's the failure to link the immediate things you're talking about to larger sets of social relations. It's the absence of any kind of systemic overview. It's the total ahistorical quality of that information where you can talk about Saddam Hussein for 4 years and all his evils and all this and never once mention that he was set up and put in there by the CIA. His first gig was an assassination against the democratically elected prime minister of Iraq. He botched it. He just wounded him. And they ushered him out and hid him in a safe house in Syria or Saudi Arabia, I forget. And that Saddam Hussein was CIA. He was Washington's poster boy in his worst, most murderous years. Washington loved him. They sigged him on Iran to go fight a war. And when he got into power, he killed every communist, every progressive, every Democrat, every constitutionalist he could get his hands on. He even wiped out the whole left wing of his own Ba'athist party. This is never mentioned about Saddam Hussein. Never mentioned that he was once the White House and Washington's best boy in the Middle East. Never mentioned. All they talk about is he's a dictator and we're going to suddenly go in and get him. Yeah, it's just a suppression of information. But they give you so much information. It's sort of so many calories and so lacking in nutrients. You know, that's the way I feel when I watch the news. It's like I've just been eating some 5 slices of Wonder Bread or something. You know, like that sort of. My dad had an Italian bakery, and our big joke about Wonder Bread, which was one of our competitors, was they call it Wonder Bread because you wonder, after you eat it, you wonder if it's bread, you know. Having said all this, we should not conclude that people are always recalcitrant and unreceptive as communicatees when things are sent to them. When communication fits into their presumed field of background assumptions, they swallow the message without chewing it over. I mean, it's amazing what you really see. I keep observing it. People will hear an opinion on the air, or they'll read something, and then they will incorporate it, unedited, unexamined, as their own. They just internalize it and they repeat it. Even though it's of limited information and prepackaged, and if you question them a little closely, they may not be able to carry it too far. I call this the parrot syndrome. People will just hear something on the air and then just repeat it as if it's their own opinion. And this is very noticeable, by the way, in the area of foreign policy, which I'll get to. It's very noticeable in the area of U.S. foreign policy, and where Americans are at. The absence of political economic content, the absence of a historical perspective is never more evident than in the discussion about empire. Now that's a rather fascinating word, empire, you know. When I was, wait, let me tell you about a book I wrote. I wrote a book called The Assassination of Julius Caesar, published in 2003. I discovered an interesting thing, that most of the historic literature on empire is rather favorable. Whether the people are writing about the Mongol Empire or the Roman Empire or various other empires, empires are seen as grand accomplishments, bringing stability and peace and dominion where before there had been just a lot of squabbling tribes. We even give empires peace names. I mean, the empires give themselves the peace names, and we accept these names. Pax Romana, Pax Britannica. There are even a couple of books written on Pax Americana. Critical, though, a little bit ironic. Empires are often seen as innocent, unintentional accretions. They just grow. They just happen to grow. They arise stochastically. Stochasticism is the theory that says that things happen randomly, by chance. Stuff just happens, you know. I used to hear in my younger days that the British Empire was put together in a fit of absent-mindedness. Anybody ever hear that phrase? Some of you are old enough to remember those phrases. British historian Cyril Robinson, and I quote him in the book I did, Assassination of Julius Caesar, because he says the same thing about the Roman Empire. He says, it was perhaps almost as true of Rome as of Great Britain. Robinson is a Brit, as you would guess, with a first name like Cyril. It was almost as true of Rome as of Great Britain that she acquired her world domination in a fit of absence of mind. Yeah, right. More recently, in 2003, 4 months after the U.S. invaded Iraq, and referring to the invasion of Iraq, The Economist, a conservative British publication, a lot of you know this magazine, The Economist, wrote as follows in an unsigned commentary. Empires are born in funny ways, and sometimes via the law of unintended consequences. They are born by accident. There you go. You know, I'm sorry, but empires are not innocent, absent-minded, accidental, unintentional, stochastic accretions. They are given force by purpose-driven rulers who consciously have to mobilize vast amounts of men and materials to conquer and plunder far-off places that are specifically targeted. The British just didn't happen to find themselves in India. They were pursuing dominion and conquest. Another thing you often don't read about, which really should get a little more emphasis, is that empires kill people. It's amazing how many people have been slaughtered and killed and murdered in Asia, Africa, Latin America because of the conquistadors of one kind or another. It's a sort of slid over, you know. That tribe was wiped out, and then so they had to bring African slaves in to do the work, and they just sort of dance along on the blood of whole peoples. Empires also impoverish people. Now that's a datum that is really never looked at. Maybe for these reasons the term empire was never applied to the United States. In fact, when I wrote my book, I wrote a book in 1995, it's almost 12 years ago, called Against Empire. When it first came out, some people said, oh, Parenti, isn't that a bit much against empire? I mean, the U.S. foreign policy, you can criticize, but what are you calling it an empire for? I said, well, you know, it is. Really, it does what empires do. No, U.S. doesn't pursue empire. It propagates democracy. It fights humanitarian wars and all that, you know. But a few years later, 5 years later, by about 2000, the books all started coming out. Everyone started writing and talking about empire and writing books with the title of empire and meaning the U.S. empire. Sorrows of Empire, Follies of Empire, Twilight of Empire, Empire at the Crossroads, Empire Gonna Get Your Mama. You know, I made that last one up. It wasn't really. Even conservatives started to use the word. In the pundit talk shows, they would get up and say, we're an empire, we better realize it and act like an empire and take on the responsibilities of an empire. We've got this kind of global power and we now have a responsibility to use it. A very interesting idea that this power gives you entitlement to use it on other people. It's a very interesting moral ethic, isn't it? Well, how is it, I asked myself, how is it everybody's using this word empire? Because most of these people are not radicals really and such. And then I began to, and use empire, I mean using empire to mean the United States foreign policy. How does that happen? Can't be that I led the way. They didn't all say, oh, Parenti's doing it, he's a trailblazer, let's follow in his footpath. I don't think that was it. Although in my weaker moments I like to, but no. And I realized that why they're doing it and how they do it. I realized that the word has been divested of its full meaning. Empire seems to mean simply dominion and power. What's missing from the public discourse is the process. And again, the political, economic content. Remember I said empires impoverish people. For while we hear a lot about empire, we don't hear about what it is that empires do. There's another word that's missing all the time almost, it seems. The other word is imperialism. That's what empires do. Empires do imperialism. That's the process, an essence of empire. And imperialism is not only the process, it is the political, economic content. And imperialism is when the dominant interest in one country, the dominant interest, not the American people, but the dominant interest in one country go out and they expropriate the land, the labor, the natural resources, the markets, and the capital of another country. sometimes in collusion with some of the dominant interests in that country too. So the unit of analysis is not necessarily the nation, it's the class interest in the respective countries. Empire involves plunder, tribute, as I said, natural resources, markets. It involves expropriating the land, the crops, the cheap labor, or the slave labor, as in ancient Rome. Empires are enormously profitable, mostly for the ruling class of the imperial country, whether it's the East India Company or the Bank of England in an earlier time, or some Roman proconsuls, or today's corporate America. Empires are enormously profitable. Empires are also enormously costly for the common populace, especially, of course, of the targeted nation, the conquered nation, but also the common people of the imperial country also pay a price. The empire feeds off of the republic's resources. The people pay the taxes and do without essentials so that the patricians can pursue their far-off plunder. The center is bled so that the perimeter can be ever expanded and expanded and expanded. And if you want to know how the bleeding goes, just look around. I mean, I travel all over this country. I pick up the local papers. It almost seems like the same story again. City council facing budget crises, state assembly voting cuts on services, blah, 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 blah. We got to do that. We got to close those public libraries. We got to, you saw our peerless leader just this past week vetoing any extension of medical insurance for low-income children. We got to do that sort of thing. We got to cut library hours and close public hospitals, as I said, and leave bridges under-repaired and take your chances when your car goes down into the river and all that stuff. That kind of thing's got to happen because we really need that money for conquest. And that's where it's going. It's enormous. I mean, it's an enormous increase in military spending, over $500 billion every year. That, depending on how you want to calculate it, it's up to $700 billion if you want to count interest payments and veterans expenses and so forth and so on. It's enormous. Conservation programs are being cut. Medicare is under siege. Programs for disabled children are being cut. Well, why do these writers talk about empire without ever mentioning imperialism? Because they want to stay within the dominant paradigm. They prefer to make a liberal complaint rather than a radical analysis. They assume a community of interest between the plutocratic investors and the working people of the recipient countries when there is none. Consider the war in Iraq. Consider that the reasons given by the administration to justify the war, Al-Qaeda, weapons of mass destruction, Saddam Hussein was a mad dictator worse than Hitler who might threaten the whole world, and so forth. Consider that these things have all proven false. Does that really mean that the policy is imbecilic? Does that really mean that the people who are running this whole thing just aren't as smart as you and me? Is that what it means? Because our rulers try to mislead and confuse us, now they were consciously lying to us, consciously wanting us to think one thing about Iraq rather than something else. Were they just doing that out of malice or confusion? The fact that they want to mislead us and confuse us does not necessarily mean that they are misled and confused. It doesn't necessarily mean that at all. It could mean that they're manipulating us for other reasons. The war in Iraq is not a stupid blunder. It's true it's had unintended consequences. They were hoping they were going to walk in, take it over, strip the economy, do the things they had to do, wipe out the Ba'athist officer class, put in their own stooges, set up a little dummy parliamentary thing, and then take the oil and use Iraq as a base. I mean, look at Iraq where it is. What do you got around it? My God, you got Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Kuwait, so forth. Lebanon. It's right there in the hub. You get that, you've got a grip. So it's not a stupid blunder. It's not a well-intentioned undertaking that went awry. Iraq has been very good for a number of very powerful interests. It served notice to the Middle East and the world that countries that chart an independent, self-defining, self-developing course risk being destroyed. I gave you that scenario before. Let me explain why that shift came. That Saddam Hussein was Washington's poster boy, and then suddenly he's Washington's latest demonized leader by 2002. Or earlier, really. The old man, George Bush Sr., was already demonizing him. What was the change that came about back in when was that? 90, when was the first Gulf War? 91, yeah, I was going to say 91, 92. Saddam Hussein just turned out not to be a good comprador leader. He was not the kind of leader that imperialism expects. And that kind of leader is one who sits there and opens up the door and says, come on in, boys, it's all yours. The land, the labor, the resources, if the workers get out of line, I'll crack their heads. With the army you've helped build up and advise me with. Just make sure I get my cut, my brother Jose gets his cut, or my brother Abdul, depending what part of the world we're in. He turned out not to do that. He was a self-defining. And that is now who's being targeted. Any country that tries to use the land, the labor, the natural resources, and the markets of that country in a different way, outside of this global system of free market expropriation. Any country that does that, whether it be Libya or Yugoslavia or Iraq, will be targeted and demonized as an enemy country. And Saddam Hussein kept a 100% publicly owned economy. Donald Rumsfeld made a very interesting and very revealing statement, I thought. He said, it's a Stalinist economy. I chuckled at the use of the term. It's completely state-run and owned. He was training cadres of engineers. He was putting in educational programs. He'd done these various things, along with a lot of corruption and a lot of brutality. But this explains why he was Washington's friend when he was his most murderous and torturous, and now suddenly he was Washington's enemy. He was charting a independent, self-developing, self-defining course. So he was put on, and all of the Middle East was put on notice, just as the invasion of Grenada put all the Caribbean on notice. If you go your own way, this is what's going to happen. The Marines are coming down on your neck. And so that is part of the very central core of empire building and U.S. foreign policy for many generations. That is to help do whatever we can to make the world safe for the free market global empire. 100 companies made billions of dollars in government contracts. There's 113 billion barrels of quality crude oil, estimated worth $10 trillion. Oil concessions that Saddam had made with Russia, China, Italy, Malaysia, France. All of these concessions have been canceled, and now they've been given exclusively to U.S. and British contractors, if ever they can pacify the country and get it out. Iraq was a great excuse, the Iraq War, for the U.S. war makers to increase the U.S. defense budget in 1 year by some 30, or in 2 years, by some 30 to 40%, depending on how you want to calculate defense spending. Iraq had switched from dollars to euros as its resource currency. Now, oil-producing countries getting off the dollar and going to euros, that is a very real threat to dollar investors and to the dollar. Not anymore. Iraq is back on the dollar, as you might expect. Iraq and Saddam Hussein supported Palestinian liberation and was highly critical of Israel's attacks on Palestine. there's no more support for Palestinian liberation coming from Iraq. Iraq had an entirely state-owned economy. I already talked about that. It's been totally smashed, and the pieces have been privatized and the rest has been smashed. Iraq was prosperous and of some influence in the Middle East. It was a bad example. Here's a self-defining, self-developing way to go. Other countries might want to copy that. Iraq had the highest standard of living in the Middle East, which may not be saying too much, but it was something. That has to be done away with. So this is not U.S. ignorance or confusion at work. This isn't good intentions gone astray. This was deliberate, conscious reactionism and imperialism. Bush and Cheney knew what they wanted to do, and they did it. As I say, they did miscalculate. They didn't expect it to be this politically costly and this costly in blood. They don't care about the blood. They don't worry about the deaths of these foot soldiers. What the hell do they care about? They were cutting veterans' benefits. He was cutting veterans' benefits. I've got a whole chunk on that, a book I wrote called Super Patriotism, how the Bush administration was cutting the veterans' benefits, charging them something like $30 a day for meals in the hospitals, and doing these crazy things. And Congress went ballistic when they caught wind of this, and so they dropped some of these things. But these are just these are your sons, and it's theirs. It's not the sons of their class. These are the guys off the street corners, the high school kids they recruit. The empire has never really worried about the blood of its foot soldiers. It worries when that becomes an issue among the populace, because one of the people they've got to fool are the American people themselves. And they do that two ways. One, by playing on their pride. This is a messianic nation. We are an inspiration to people all over the world. We have to teach them democracy and humanitarian respect and all that mythology. And two, even far more effective, by playing on their fear. That the terrorists are here, the terrorists are there. The terrorists are a godsend. 9/11 was a godsend. So much so that many people suspect it wasn't God who sent it. This brings us to another question about perception and deception. Do those who put forth the lies of empire, do they believe what they tell us? And the answer there, you don't have to agonize over that too much. The answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. That an opinion so well serves one's self-interest doesn't necessarily mean it is hypocritically embraced. The more it serves one's self-interest, the more it is all the more sincerely held. It seems very persuasive by the very fact that it's so serviceable. It's so nice. Why would I discard this opinion? Why would I reject it as an irritant? So they do believe in the dominant paradigm. It defines their world for them. It assures them of their self-worth, that they have rightful access and possession of all their wrongfully acquired principles and privileges and wealth. They believe, along with one of their progenitors, Alexander Hamilton, that the country should be run by the rich and the well-born. They completely believe they are deserving of their station in life. Absolutely. As was said about George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr., they said he was born on third base and he grew up all the while thinking he had hit a triple, you know. Not many baseball fans here, so I guess that doesn't click. They believe that America should lead the world and that they should lead America. They believe the poor are the authors of their own poverty and they more or less deserve what they get in life. And the working class are a troublesome lot who need to be reined in along with the middle class, both of whom have to ratchet down their standard of living a lot more, learn to work a lot harder so that those at the top can get what they properly deserve, which they believe they do deserve. Now, do they believe the propaganda they put out in support of specific policies? Well, obviously, sometimes they deliberately fabricate. It's so obvious. You know it when you catch them in inconsistencies. When you invite Alberto Gonzalez to a hearing and you discover he's suffering a severe case of Alzheimer or amnesia or something, you know that, of course, they lie, and they know they're caught in lies, and they squirm in those lies sometimes. You see, much of the time, truth is not even a consideration with our policymakers. It's not what's true. It's very much more like the advertising world. There's no truth in the advertising world. In advertising, the prime consideration is this ad going to sell the product or isn't it? If it doesn't sell the product, then it's canceled. If it sells the product, then it's true. I mean, the approach to truth is purely instrumental. Can we use this or not use it? And is the message effective? Is it getting across? If it is, then it's true. Take the propaganda line, cut and run and stay the course. Bush stopped using stay the course because they started doing these panel analyses and surveys, and they found that people were beginning to develop a negative reaction to his phrase, stay the course, because it sounded too open-ended. In other words, it said, stay in Iraq forever, and they really didn't like it. He stopped using it. Now, is he being sincere, insincere, truthful? Those questions are irrelevant. He's being purely instrumental. He's doing what he has to do. And by the way, don't think for a moment that these leaders don't care what you think. That's all they care about. They're constantly concerned about that. They're constantly bombarding and manipulating and testing and checking and following up and getting the feedback and then adjusting and hitting you with some new image and such. So when they put out a particular line, the question, do they believe it themselves or don't they? My suggestion is that's not even a question in their minds, so why should it be a question in yours? Do they believe in their own virtue? I've already answered that. Yes, capital Y. Yes, 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 do they believe in their own virtue? All people, parties, national leaders believe in their own virtue. It's only in movies where the villain gets a terrible feeling of conscience. And, Javert in Les Miserables is so strung out by being treated so good, and he's been so rotten, he throws himself off a bridge. Yeah, right. No, he doesn't. He would have killed Jean Valjean the next minute and laughing. He said, you stupid thing, why did you let me go? At least that's the way they behave in the real world for the most part, with some rare exceptions. All people, all parties, all national leaders, all nations believe in their own virtue. But even more so, more than anything else in the world, more than all of these things I've been talking about, they believe with the utmost ferocity, with the utmost dedication, they believe in protecting and advancing their own interests. And they will kill to make sure those interests are advanced. Well, I'm going to sort of wind it up right here. Let me just end. You got to end on some kind of positive note. Now that I've sufficiently depressed you all, let me say, I think there is room for hope. There sometimes are limits to how well officialdom and the corporate press can finesse reality. During World War II, the German public, for instance, talk about propaganda machines, the Nazi regime in World War II. I had an acquaintance back at Brown University in an earlier lifetime. Remember I met him. He had been a school kid in Germany during the war. I said, did you believe all that stuff? I mean, did you, He said, well, about the war, we knew something was going wrong. I said, how would you know? That's the last thing. I mean, that's the first thing governments lie about is the war. He said, well, they kept talking about our victorious German armies. And we'd have a map up in the class, but we kept noticing we kept winning victories further and further, closer and closer to Germany, and then finally we were winning victories in Germany, and then finally we realized we're losing this war. How could we keep winning all these victories, and yet our forces were retreating? So there was a reality there. There's a limits. Reality does present certain limits to propaganda sometimes. Something of the same reality principle applies to Vietnam and Iraq, when our leaders keep saying, oh, it's getting a lot better and it's going well and all that, and the bodies keep piling up, of Iraqis especially, hundreds and thousands of them. However, in Vietnam and Iraq, I noticed the same similarity in the way the debate goes, how the dominant paradigm rules out a certain position, that the debate is completely between those who say we can win the war and those who say we can't win the war. You see, if your call for withdrawal is on the grounds that we can't win the war, then the implication is that, well, gee, if we could win the war, then I'd be with you guys too. There's another position that's not ever taken in, and this was true with Vietnam, the exact same arguments, and that position was whether we win or don't win, whatever win is supposed to mean, this is not a war we should be fighting. It does not serve the interests of the American people, nor the interests of the Vietnamese or the Iraqi peoples. That position, that what was happening is that this war is an imperialist crime, that position does not get exposure on the mainstream media. It is outside the dominant paradigm. We should also keep in mind, and this is another slim, hopeful thing, is that indoctrination and propagandizing do not operate with perfect effect. In the face of all monopolistic ideological manipulation, some people still develop a skepticism toward the official ideology. Reality is a problem for the ruling class, not for us. Reality is their problem. It has to be constantly finessed. It has to be constantly misrepresented because reality is radical. You see, reality is radical. It's not us. When we say that millions of Americans don't have health insurance, that's not our ideology that we're kind of making an argument or fabricating. That's reality. They've got to then finesse it and say something about it and say, well, we don't want government running your lives and this and that. When we say that the other millions, the other 70% who do have health insurance are getting screwed over because the medical insurance companies are ripping off and refusing to pay and all that sort of thing. Michael Moore just did a very good movie on that. You should all go see. That's not something we say that just comes from our left or radical or liberal or Marxist or whatever label someone wants to give you from our analysis, right? That's reality. And they're the ones who have to say something about it. And when Bush gets up and says, we've got the best health system in the world, we got the best health system. For him, yeah, he's got the best health system in the world, you can be sure. And it's all socialistic. He's on socialized medicine, Bush is, and he finds it perfect. He hasn't rejected it. He hasn't gotten up and said, I reject this socialized medicine. I reject having to report to Reed Hospital. I reject all of this stuff. I reject all these army of doctors who come to give me every single thing. I want to pay for my own private insurance, my own private medical care. He hasn't done that. He accepts his socialism. It's interesting. He just doesn't want us to have any socialism. So when reality is radical, there's a limit to how many lies people can swallow about the false realities they're experiencing. So along with institutional stability, we have popular ferment and popular innovation. Along with ruling class coercion, we have mass resistance and skepticism. All social institutions of capitalist society have a dichotomous tension in them. They must sustain the few while appearing to serve the many. Whether it's the media, whether it's universities, whether it's the law or whatever else, they are always supposedly serving. They are serving the few, but they must give an appearance to sustain or help the many. And to do that, they sometimes must make concessions. Years ago, the American philosopher William James said that custom and culture can operate as a sedative, while novelty and dissidence are rejected as an irritant. Yet I would argue that after a while, sedatives can become suffocating and irritants can enliven. People sometimes hunger for the discomforting perspective that gives them a more meaningful or new explanation. By becoming aware of this, we have a better chance of moving against the tide, a better chance of resisting the deadening hand of fundamentalist free market plutocracy and exposing the dominant paradigm for the suffocating, dirty little box that it is. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to, if I can, ask about your, I definitely agreed with your point that the invasion of Iraq was imperialist, and the shift in how the U.S. saw Saddam Hussein had to do with how he was no longer serving the purposes of empire. But it really seemed like you were trying to put as positive a spin on him as you possibly could, and I thought that was a way that just seemed like sort of instrumental rather than factual interpretation of the truth, because he's always been behaving in the same sort of imperialist logic as the United States. He's been confined to his borders since after he invaded Kuwait and was pushed back into them, but still doing the same stuff using different strategies. Why don't you try to highlight the fact that the U.S. is not the only sort of imperialist logic in the world right now?
I don't think I put a positive spin on him. I said he was a murderer and a torturer, and he'd done some terrible things. Yeah, horrible things, and he was corrupt. What more do you want me to say? I'm not quite know. But I think you should differential object appraisal. You should also acknowledge that he has put in these programs, and that's what they didn't like about him. And he did chart.
Didn't he do those because it served his power?
For his power. But if I send your kid to school to serve my power, your kid's still going to school, and this was, and if I take the oil earnings and use it for some of the oil earnings to build that school, the guys over there aren't going to like that. I wasn't saying that he was slipping into becoming a social democrat in his old age or anything like that. Not at all. I'm sorry, if I didn't emphasize the negativity enough. Saddam Hussein was not my hero, and I would want to see changes happen in Iraq. You see, there were changes in Iraq. This is the irony. This is part of the ahistorical thing. In 1958, the Iraqi people had this remarkable democratic revolution. They kicked out the rulers, and they took over the oil. They kicked out British Petroleum and the American companies, and they nationalized the oil industry, and they're doing all this stuff. All of that democratic, it's such a bitter hypocrisy to say we're going in there to teach the Iraqis self-rule. This is a 5,000-year civilization, but to teach them democracy, when you don't, and you make no mention, it's down the memory hole. It's just gone. There isn't one person in the mainstream media who talks about the fact that the U.S. undid and destroyed that democratic revolution of 1958. It's like today with all the stuff on Burma. Oh, the monks and these brutal generals and all that. Not a word ever comes out. Who put those generals in 1960 when Burma was moving toward a populist democratic kind of government? And who killed about 3,000 people and smashed them with death squads and everything else? It's down the memory hole. You don't get it. It's ahistorical. The people who are standing, let's make that the last number of people, okay? And then
my question is, was there ever a time in American history, maybe going back to the days of Norman Thomas, who gave us Social Security, was there ever a real political dialogue in the media?
In the mainstream media?
In the mainstream, because we had radio and, of course, newspapers.
No. You had Upton Sinclair. Who am I thinking of? The other one who wrote the Brass Check. He's gone. All right. No, you had books being written then exposing how the media was such they didn't call it the media, they called it newspapers, because that's all we had were newspapers. So for about 160, 70 years, it was newspapers. Radio came in, and at first, radio was a very marginal medium. not taken too seriously, and little stations, not that many people owned radios back in 1920, so there wasn't much to it. And so most of the programs and stations were owned by churches, community groups, even labor unions that actually owned a couple of radio stations. There's one of the failures of propaganda. 80 years of labor study in America, and these guys, by now they should have a network of their own. They just don't know what to do with the media. And then after a while, when people started, when big business in America started realizing, hey, people are buying radios. You can get into every single home. You no longer have to ring the doorbell and try to get your foot in the door. You can get into 50,000 homes in this particular area on one radio station. Boom! They came and they bought everything up. So there's never been a time when there's really been a democratic, pluralistic mainstream media. There are a democratic alternative for all their faults. There are some community radio stations and public access TV and such. Now we have some things on the internet and that you can see and watch, which are outside the mainstream. Yes.
Earlier you spoke about the mainstream media. I noted a couple of years after the war got underway, the war in Iraq, I think the New York Times, and I believe it was the Washington Post, basically apologized for the fact that they had seemed to get the war wrong. My thought on listening carefully is not that they got things wrong, but they really have been supporters, co-supporters of the war from the very beginning.
And when they can no longer deny the thing they, quote, got wrong, they say, oh, we got it wrong. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think you should say that, oh, the media dropped the ball on this one, or, oh, gee, they got it wrong. Boy, did they get it wrong. They're paid very well to get it wrong. I mean, they're paid very well to talk around the thing, and not ever get that thing. Get it right. Okay, yeah.
Just this morning, I was talking to someone from out in your area, Berkeley, the War Resisters League, and mentioned to her that this coming Saturday night here in Binghamton, we're having a teach-in on impeachment. And she said, that's really a good idea. Maybe we should get something moving out here. I'm just wondering, on the West Coast, is there any sort of movement? In fact, we have Elizabeth de la Vega as one of the speakers coming in, along with John Nichols from The Nation, at this activity on Saturday night over at the Forum Theater. If I can squeeze in a second one real quick. Last week I was in Slovenia.
Is this really a disguised infomercial here?
Yes, it is. But I really do respect your view on that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. The second one, quite different, second comment was in Slovenia just last week. I talked to a number of people and it just sort of rang a bell with what you're saying about, your experience in your books, et cetera, on that area. That here we are in 2007, and the people are saying, we don't know what we're going to do. We just, there's 7% of the population that seems to have been able to gain control here, and it's just a little clique, and we were educated. This one woman I spoke to speaks 6 languages, and she's worried that she's going to have any retirement at all. So there are two things, but your comment first, if you don't mind, on the possibility of a movement, a grassroots movement in this late stage on impeachment, and the second one, maybe Slovenia. Do you have any background or any information you can give us on Slovenia?
I don't think in terms of ruling cliques. When you say a clique, it sounds like it's just a bunch of cronies who are running things. They generally have a very powerful, even if it's implicit, even if it's something they just hint at to each other at the Bohemian Club or at the Knickerbocker Club in New York or at the Council of Foreign Relations or wherever they have Trilateral Commission. They confabulate all the time, and they know what their interests are. And their only discussion is how do we best secure and advance those interests? And they could have differences on that. I mean, you see a crisis right now in the ruling class, very much so. There's a good movie out, documentary called No Exit in Sight. Is that it? Is that the name of it? Yeah. it's very good. What? No end in sight, that's right. It's very good because it's a movie about the differences in the ruling class. I mean, both sides are one are the smart imperialists, and the other are the dumb Bush imperialists. And the smart imperialists saying things like, what did he destroy this for? What did he destroy? Why did he strip the whole Ba'athist officer corps? And half of those guys went and got into the Sunni insurgency. They would have served him. We could have done it this way. In other words, and you find yourself supporting the good imperialists, meaning good, meaning the more efficient ones who would kill a few less people in doing what they're doing. You know, who in effect, they don't actually come out and say, but in effect they're saying, we could have killed a few less people. We could have gotten away with killing and gotten a better return per pint of blood. We could have gotten a lot better. And but you do see, and there were some of them were pretty big policy-making people. I mean, there are people, you know, there are generals and there are others in the plutocracy. Not that many though, but they're moving away. So they do have fights over how to do it, but they know, and it's not the rich. John Edwards was right. He said, this is not a battle between the rich and the poor. This is a battle between the super rich and the rest of us. It really is that fraction of 1% that owns the lion's share of everything, and those are the guys who are going for broke, and they want to control it. As far as impeachment, I think it's a good political way of delegitimating the Bush administration. It's only a symbolic thing. That's all it could possibly be. Because even if we succeed in impeaching him, which would be a very close vote in the House, what does that mean? Impeachment is nothing. All that means is then he would have to stand trial in the Senate. Bill Clinton was impeached for lying about doing something that wasn't a crime, dallying with an intern. But he lied about it under oath, and so he was impeached for that reason. And then he stood trial in the U.S. Senate. Most Americans think impeachment means removal of the person from office. And impeachment is an indictment. That's all it is. If you want to knock yourself out on getting this indictment, which will then never go anywhere because the Senate is not going. You need 2/3 of the vote in the Senate to remove him from office, and you wouldn't get that. But I would think, I sort of agree with John Conyers that I would think that that time and energy might be better used for really pushing the issues and making and deepening the analysis. Okay, the last speaker. Are there two people standing there or one? You two. Well, let's hear from. Okay, you'll be next, so you can break the male monopoly after Jim. Jim Petrus, is that you?
Yes, that's
Well, this
me.
is Professor Petrus, who at Professor Emeritus here at SUNY Binghamton, really the premier analyst of world affairs in America. Jim Petrus puts all the rest of us in a humble position. He's terrific. And I know he's going to take issue with some of the things I said.
No, Michael, it was a brilliant lecture, and it gives hope to everyone over 39 that there's a future in intellectual efforts. But I want to just mention one thing, Michael, supplementing or complementing your presentation. That is the powerful voice and influence of the Zionist power structure in America. It wasn't just Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney. We had people in the second and third position, Wolfowitz. We had Feith, number 2 and 3. We had the Special Study Committee that was headed by Chomsky. We had Irving Leibowitz, alias Scooter Libby, as the top advisor in the Vice President's office. We have Wormser, who calls for the bombing of Iran and is a top-rated Zionist in the administration. I could run the list down and down. We had Richard Pearl.
And I thought Jews were Democrats. They're all in this Republican administration.
Well,
Go ahead.
Democrats are Republic. Their first loyalty was to Israel.
Right.
And I just want to raise that issue as a point of discussion in determining the role that U.S. imperialism takes in particular regions where there are very powerful domestic interests involved. And I think that needs to be taken account, especially since the prime driving force for the war in Iran is the Zionist power configuration. They are the leading cutting edge, and I read all their publications, and I get their newsletters from the presidents of the major Jewish organizations in America. Every single issue, 5 days a week, throughout the year, they have at least 5 or 6 articles calling for war with Iran, sanctions against Iran, etc. And I think this is very dangerous, especially when they're repressing dissidents. I call your attention to Bishop Tutu's meeting being canceled in a small liberal arts college because the Zionist Organization of America pressured the president of Catholic University and told him that Tutu, for criticizing Israel, is an anti-Semite. And the Jewish sensibilities would be offended if the Nobel Prize winner spoke. And I think it's time we stood up to the Israel lobby and all their apologists. We got to show some courage and integrity on their role in repressing our democratic rights here in America.
It should be pointed out, to supplement what you said, Jim, that any number of the critics of Israel's policy toward Palestine and policy in the Middle East are themselves Jewish American. So the Jewish community in America does not speak with one voice, and these high-powered lobbyists do not represent all of the, 6 million Jewish Americans. And that when you criticize Israel, you're not being anti-Semitic. We run into that crap right here. When you criticize Bush and the U.S. policy, we're being anti-American, we're told. So you criticize Berlusconi when he was prime minister of Italy. Does that mean you're anti-Italian? Should I, as an Italian-American who has a secret nationalism for the old country, should I really see you as a bigot in that sense? No. You criticize. If we criticize China's policy, does that mean we are hateful of Asians and Chinese in particular? We got to criticize everybody we can and point out the extent to which the influences. Generally speaking, and that's why it's a touchy thing, generally speaking, someone's ethnic background is immaterial. It's one of the least important things. It's where he stands and what he's doing. In this case, though, it does seem that there is this attachment to Israel, and there is a premier loyalty. So in that sense, it is a factor that's worth looking at. But as I say, you also have many critics of Israeli policy who are, where I live, in fact, I'm thinking of Barbara Lubin, Jeffrey Blankford, and where I live in the Bay Area, Dennis Bernstein. They're the most vehement opponents and critics of Israel are Jewish themselves. So let's put that to rest. Let's put that issue to rest about it. And thank you for your comments, Jim. Yeah.
I was really struck by the last comment you made, that institutions in a capitalist society must sustain the few while appearing to serve the many. As a pastor, a clergywoman who is very frustrated by the betrayal of silence of the mainstream churches about the condition of America today and the wars, I feel like maybe the church is one of those institutions. Could you comment on your thoughts about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How about almost 2,000 years of the Roman Church and its collaboration with the big landowners and such? By the 5th century A.D., the Roman Church was the largest slaveholder in Europe, because it was the largest landholder too. A collusion. How about the Protestant clergy for 200 years sending out vehement, vigorous apologies for slavery in America? And the Southern clergy vehemently pushing slavery, the Northern clergy tepidly making apologies for slavery. But just about all of them The abolitionists weren't men of the cloth. Yeah, no, the churches have a huge, horrible record of going with the dominant interests all the time. But then again, of course, you get people like Martin Luther King and Father Roy Bourgeois, Father Aristide, and all the liberation theology people, the social gospel people at the turn of the century in America in 1910, 1920. So you have a range of opinions there, but generally, yes, giving the impression of serving people, giving them grace, giving them comfort, giving them hope, love, Jesus loves you, the last sort of thing, while also being linked to very entrenched interests. Yes. Well, thank you very much for coming out.